Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we will make a start. Thank you for joining today's webinar, which is preparing for regulatory and technological change across the medical device landscape. Please note that this webinar will be recorded. If there are any questions, please put them in the Q&A section, which is on the top bar of your Teams window, and we can run through these later during the Q&A section of the webinar. If you have any feedback throughout, please use the link in the chat that will be provided, and we will get going. So I am Paula Sweeton. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. I'm Paula Sweeton, and I've been a project manager at InnoScot Health for just over 2 years. Before joining InnoScot Health, I previously worked in clinical trials for the pharmaceutical industry and in academic research management. Leading today's webinar, we have Elaine Gemmell, who is the Head of Regulatory Affairs at InnoScot Health, and our guest speaker, Dr. Paul Campbell, a Senior Clinical Advisor at the MHRA. Elaine joined InnoScot Health in 2002 and helped to establish the organisation. She's a certified ISO 13485 and ISO 9001 lead auditor with experience of regulatory approval and CE marking for medical devices. She has a BSc BEng in engineering and previously worked for Motorola Semiconductors for 20 years. Following on from Elaine today, we'll also have Dr. Paul Campbell, who is a highly respected clinician and expert in the field of healthcare information technology and regulations. After starting his career as a pharmacist, Dr. Campbell transitioned to medicine and became a consultant anaesthetist within the clinical informatics team became he's got over 25 years of experience across multiple clinical and digital domains. He's held several clinical NHS and e-health roles, including as a clinical director and clinical informatics team in the NHS National Services Scotland. He's also a clinical advisor to the Scottish Government Digital Health and Care Department and is currently working as a senior clinical advisor within the software and AI group at the MHRA. I'll now pass over to Elaine, who will take us through the regulatory changes that are coming to the medical device landscape, and then we will go over to Paul, who will take us through artificial intelligence as a medical device.
Can I have the first slide, please, Jane? So welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar today. For a number of months, I've been doing presentations and training sessions on how you regulate medical devices and looking at what's happening with respect to Europe and the UK. Today, I'm going to do something just a bit different. As you're aware, there have been lots of changes in the regulatory landscape due to changes in regulations, standards being updated, additional requirements for notified and approved bodies, and just trying to keep abreast of the changing technology and what has happened in the light of the UK exiting the European Union. What I hope to do today is to summarise all of the changes and to provide some clarity on what we can expect to see when these changes are fully implemented. Can you go to the previous slide, please, Jane? So before we start, what I will do is take a look at the regulatory landscape as it has been prior to the UK exiting the European Union. So while the UK was part of Europe, everyone worked to the Medical Device Directive. And as part of the European Union, the UK also worked to that directive. Clearly, this directive has been in place for a number of years, and there were some deficiencies. Technology has moved on. There's been new requirements. It hasn't really kept up with all the new technology. So there was a recognition that we needed to update and to make the medical device regulations much more robust. So the Medical Device Directive being a European directive, had to be transposed into law in the United Kingdom, and this was done under a statutory instrument. So the statutory instrument that amended the European directive set out 3 different pieces of legislation within the UK that we worked to for device regulation. There was the directive for medical devices, one for active implantable devices, and one for in vitro diagnostic devices. The CE mark is the conformity assessment mark that you apply to products to put onto the market to show that you've complied with all the requirements to make them safe and effective. The new requirements that I talked about being more robust were set out in the medical device regulation, which was intended to be implemented throughout Europe. Being a regulation, this was directly applicable in all member states, and there was no requirement to transpose it into local laws. So the medical device regulation was set out, initially published in 2017 with a 3-year transition window. So it was expected to be fully implemented throughout Europe and the United Kingdom in 2020. Had that happened according to plan, the UK exiting the European Union had set out within a withdrawal agreement that at December 2020 there would be a snapshot of particular laws that were implemented in Europe, and these would automatically become UK law. So had the medical device regulation been implemented in Europe in 2020, in May, at the end of that transition window in December 2020, the new regulation would have transposed into UK law, and we would all be working to the same legislation. So what actually happened? Next slide, please, Jane. Because of COVID, the implementation of the medical device regulation in Europe was delayed by 12 months. That meant that it was no longer going to be implemented in May 2020 and was pushed out to May 2021. That meant that at the end of that transition window, the law that was in Europe at that particular time was the directive. So that was what transposed into UK law. So now what has happened because of that delay is that the UK and the European legislation are different. Europe currently regulates to the medical device regulation, and the UK currently legislates to the medical device directives. When the UK exited the European Union, they put forward a proposal for a new conformity assessment mark. So that is the UK CA mark. And that will be currently implemented for new devices regulated in the UK and will be applied to put product onto the UK market. In Europe, the CE mark still is applied for products put onto the European market. We'll talk about some of the plans for accepting CE mark and the timescales associated with that a bit later. But currently, the CE mark devices can still be put onto the UK market. However, UK CA mark devices cannot be put onto the European market. There is a slight further complication with Northern Ireland. Prior to Brexit, trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was quite straightforward. Both territories were in the EU, both shared the same trade rules, but the European Union has very particular border checks that have to be done when goods arrive from non-EU countries. So when the UK exited the European Union, had Northern Ireland been considered a non-EU country, there would have been additional checks put in place, and this would have implemented a hard border between the countries in Ireland. To prevent this happening, Northern Ireland continues to follow EU rules on medical devices, and a CE mark is required to place devices on the Northern Ireland market. Next slide, please. So let's look at the framework for medical device regulation. For both the directive and the regulation, the process is the same. The first stage is to satisfy or to identify the essential requirements that are set out in the directive that are applicable to your device. Just to simplify things for the purpose of this slide, I'll refer to UK legislation. So we're talking about the requirements of the medical device directive. So once you've established what essential requirements apply to your product, you'll then demonstrate how you're going to provide evidence of conformance with these requirements. This is normally achieved by using harmonised standards, although as a manufacturer you are free to use other solutions to prove compliance with the requirements. Devices should be designed within a quality management system framework. ISO 13485 is the harmonised standard that sets out regulatory requirements for medical devices. It was very recently updated to add annexes showing the relationship between the clauses of the standard and the requirements of the European Medical Device Regulations and IVD regulations. So it's also now harmonised to the Medical Device Regulation. Implementing standards will result in a body of evidence that will demonstrate compliance with the essential requirements. All of this evidence is recorded in a technical file, which is pulled together within the technical documentation, and the manufacturer signs a declaration of conformity to state the requirements of the directives have been met, and this will be also included in the technical file. Both the technical file and the implementation of the quality management system will be examined by an approved body, and the UK CA mark can then be applied to the product and it can be put onto the UK market. There are a few exceptions to this conformity assessment route. For very low risk devices that are in class 1 that don't have a measuring function and are not sterile, an approved body is not required to examine the QMS or the technical documentation. The process is that the manufacturer signs a declaration of conformity. He effectively self-confirms that you comply with the requirements, and the CE mark is applied and it's put onto the market. Next slide, please. So we're now going to talk about the implementation of future regulations. Clearly, the directive was already established as being not necessarily fit for purpose in today's new technological age, and the UK had always intended to go to a much more robust regulation framework. So in 2021, the Medicines and Medical Devices Act was put in place to allow the government the powers to amend medical device regulations. In September 2021, the MHRA launched a public consultation to gather views on future UK medical device regulations. The consultation set out particular scenarios with questions, and these questions very closely aligned with what is currently in place in the European Medical Device Regulation. Manufacturers, trade bodies, health boards, universities, and any other parties with an interest were invited to comment on the proposals. In June 2022, the response to the consultation was published. If you're interested or if you want to see what the thinking was, this is available on the MHRA website for you to download and look at. The process was that the feedback received from the consultation was documented, and then the government provided some clarification and then set out their response. And in this response, there's quite a clear indication of what the future UK regulations will look like. As a result of this response to the consultation, there will be 3 statutory instruments laid in Parliament in 2023 to implement future legislation. In April 2023, there was a statutory instrument put in place to extend the timeframe for acceptance of CE marked devices into the UK. And I'll give you some timescales associated with that just shortly. In the summer of 2023, we expect a statutory instrument which will implement much more robust post-market surveillance requirements for manufacturers. This will be done ahead of the full implementation of future legislation. So this is putting post-market surveillance right up front and implementing it at a much earlier stage than the new regulations. In winter 2023, towards the end of the year, we expect a further statutory instrument on the future medical device regulations. And this will be the first indication in full of what the regulations would look like. The expectation is that the core aspects of the future regime for medical devices will apply from the 1st of July 2025. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, what can we expect to see in the new regulations? as stated, the questions that were asked very closely aligned to the EU MDR, so it's quite safe to assume that it won't deviate too far from what is implemented in Europe. Although we won't cover all of them today, some of the proposals for the new legislation will include changes to scope, what comes into scope for medical device regulations, and this will include devices without a medical purpose. Some examples of this would be equipment for liposuction, anything with lasers, perhaps used for hair removal or tattoo removal, dermal fillers, non-prescription lenses or cosmetic implants. There'll be changes to the classification of some medical devices, and this can be quite significant for some manufacturers. In particular, the implementation of a new rule for software may result in a lot of Class 1 devices, which were previously self-certified, being reclassified to Class 2A and above, which will mean that an engagement of an approved body or a notified body will be required. Other changes to classifications will be concerned with IVF and assisted reproduction technologies, surgical mesh, total and partial joint replacements, and other technologies which potentially will go into the highest risk classification of Class 3. There will be new essential requirements introduced to the directive to make provisions for emerging technologies, such as nanomaterials, and there'll be new requirements on manufacturers to have financial coverage in place for compensation when adverse incidents occur. There'll be other changes that will provide clarity on the definition of health institutions, and the exemption will no longer apply, but there will be a requirement for registration of medical devices that have been manufactured or modified in-house by health institutions. There are particular requirements for a qualified person to be available to manufacturers on a permanent basis, and for medical devices to have unique identifiers. There are lots more changes that will come into force, and if you're interested to have advance notification of what these are, I would encourage you to go and look at the response to the consultation. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at the transitions. Next slide. So the first statutory instrument that I talked about that was laid is expected to be passed by the 30th of June 2023. What this is going to do is to extend the period when CE marked devices can be placed onto the market. So there's certain different types of scenarios that you need to be aware of. If medical devices or active implantable medical devices have been regulated in Europe to the old directives, assuming they have a current certificate, they will be accepted onto the UK market with just a CE mark until June 2028. If devices have been CE marked to the MDR or the IVDR, or they're custom-made devices that have been regulated to the medical device directives, they will be accepted with a CE mark on the UK market until June 2030. Next slide, please. So we talked about post-market surveillance being implemented ahead of the future legislation. The second statutory instrument will put in place these requirements for post-market surveillance. Under the Medical Device Directive, it's not particularly well defined, and all it says is that manufacturers should maintain a systematic procedure to review experience gained from devices in the post-production phase. That doesn't give a very clear indication of what should be included, and also it leaves it very open, so manufacturers may do very different things. The legislation that will be laid in the statutory instrument will aim to strengthen the requirements for post-market surveillance. And among other things, it will include details of what should be included in a post-market surveillance plan and a post-market surveillance system. So it will be much more prescriptive. It will look at proactive patient safety monitoring, increased reporting of adverse incidents, tighter timelines for reporting adverse events, and an indication of the frequency of how frequently these reports should be updated. It's expected to apply from mid-2024, so that will be ahead of the new regulations that are put in place for the UK. Next slide, please. So I've touched very briefly on the regulation of medical devices in Northern Ireland. And as a result, in Northern Ireland, the CE mark will still apply. Now, with the exit of the UK from the European Union, the situation with notified bodies has changed. And in the UK, we have approved bodies that are designated to do the conformity assessment. Currently, these UK approved bodies are only able to approve devices to the Medical Device Directive and apply the UK CA mark. There are provisions whereby UK notified bodies can apply for designation to conduct conformity assessment for Northern Ireland to the medical device regulation. If that was to happen, there would be a completely new mark that would indicate that, and it's the UK NI mark. Currently, there are no notified bodies designated to do that, but the provisions are there should they be appointed in the future. So to date, only the CE mark will apply in Northern Ireland. Next slide, please. So you may have heard of the Windsor Agreement that's been recently negotiated. It's a set of solutions to safeguard the supplies of medicine to Northern Ireland. And the UK and European Union have reached agreement to safeguard the supplies into Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, in this, the medical devices do not receive specific attention. So whatever was agreed under this agreement does not apply to medical devices. So the situation where you will have to have a European notified body and a CE mark for Northern Ireland still in place. So nothing has changed with that. There's a very clear indication, however, that should the Windsor Frame Agreement go well, there are provisions that additional legislation can be brought into scope, and the hope is that medical devices will be added to the future scope. Next slide, please. I talked about approved bodies, and these are bodies that are designated to do conformity assessment within the United Kingdom. As of today, there are 4 UK approved bodies, but they're designated to do slightly different things. So currently the only approved body that can do all devices, medical devices, active implantable and in vitro diagnostics is BSI. SGS are designated for medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices. DECRA, who is the most recent approved body to come on board, can do medical devices, and UL International can do IVDs. If you're going to select an approved body to regulate devices in the UK, it's important that you actually go and look at their designation, because while we say that DECRA have a designation to do medical devices, there are some different categories within medical devices that they may or may not be able to do. When I last looked, which could be out of date, I think it was the end of Q1 I last looked at it, while DECRA could do medical devices, they were not designated to do active medical devices. So they couldn't do software and they couldn't do anything that was powered. So it's important that you actually look at what they're designated for. 6 organisations have applied, in addition to this, 6 organisations have applied to become UK approved bodies. And there are more that have expressed an interest. So the hope is that as more and more approved bodies are designated, the strain that notified bodies are under or approved bodies are under will be eased. Next slide, please. So in addition to what's happening in the United Kingdom with respect to notified bodies and approved bodies being able to certify products, there is a recognition in Europe that there is a very real constraint on notified bodies being able to take devices that were previously approved to MDD and to update them with respect to the MDR. So the transitional period for compliance with the medical device regulation has been extended. The reason for this is to avoid medical device shortages and to ensure continuity of supply without compromising patient safety or performance of the device. So manufacturers are being given more time to comply with the conformity assessment of devices being regulated to medical device regulation, as long as they're covered by a certificate issued in accordance with the Medical Device Directive, and that they have engaged with a notified body and have a written contract in place with them for future conformity assessment. Under these conditions, if they satisfy both of these conditions, Class 1 devices can continue to have the CE mark and be placed on the European market in accordance with the Medical Device Directive until 2028. Similarly with Class 2A devices, Class 2B and Class 3 devices have to be in compliance by December 2027. So that is all I was going to say with respect to the future legislation. Clearly, there's a lot of things happening. And in line with changes to the regulation, one of the very high profile issues that's been talked about is the regulation of software in general, but in particular how to regulate artificial intelligence. So I'm now going to pass over to Paul, who's going to talk specifically about artificial intelligence as a medical device. So over to you, Paul.
I'm just about to hopefully share my screen. Okay. Thanks very much, Elaine, for an excellent presentation. A great coverage of the ins and outs of the regs there. But as you said, we're going to touch on artificial intelligence as a medical device now. And yeah, I'm going to tell you a bit about the ins and outs of that, the problems, the challenges of that, and hopefully, it's the wrong button. Sorry, folks. So Elaine, you mentioned at the start there, it's really software as a medical device, you know, and I'm sort of going to start at software as a medical device before getting into AI as a medical device. From the legislation point of view, it's all classed as software, to be honest, and it's probably just worth reflecting on the breadth of where software now touches the healthcare landscape. It's pretty enormous. It's sort of involved in everything now. You know, triaging diagnosis, we've got digital medicines, companion diagnostics, clinical calculators, IVD software. So software is intricately involved in all of this now, in doing great clinical things, and also potentially, if it's not done well, creating clinical problems and errors. So software is really quite a large part of the healthcare estate now, and hence the review globally about the regulations around about software. I'm going to go on to the next bit. Again, that's just this indication that artificial intelligence is currently a part of software, a sort of subset of software. I would note, though, I think we all know, you just have to look at the newspapers and you'll see that artificial intelligence is becoming ever bigger, depending on how you define artificial intelligence as well. That the size of that circle there can be bigger or smaller. So even the definition of artificial intelligence is complicated, but worth noting that it is all part of software, and we can consider it that way to start with. So in terms of starting, within MHRA, the software hub is a new page that we've published, and we've got a bunch of sort of guidance documents on it. This is one of the most recent ones. This is our sort of start point, and we try really hard to let people focus on what's the intended purpose of your software, because often it's very nebulous and it's very hard, and if you've got a nebulous purpose, it's quite difficult to prove that it works. So we've published this guidance about how to craft an intended purpose. Elaine mentioned the technical file before. This is a core part of your technical file for your product, so some guidance in there. I suppose in summary, briefly, it focuses on what does your device do, who does it do it for, who are the people that use it, and also the user environment or the use environment. So these 4 points at the end there are worth considering for your intended purpose, but there's more detailed guidance on the website there. In terms of all software, and particularly AI, but all software, we have to go on to the next thing, which is to try and classify the device. Elaine mentioned class 1 devices or class 2A devices, then there's 2B and 3. So as the classification goes up, that's in respect to the risk going up. And there are some notable features about risk when it comes to software. You know, at the click of a button, you can turn on software to millions of people that they now have access to. At the click of a button, you could run an analysis on thousands, tens of thousands of people's, records and clinical records. That could lead to output of information that determines treatment plans for them. So the size and the scale of this is really quite of note. And I think increasingly we notice that there have been a few, if you look back through the press, there have been a few notable, fairly large-scale IT problems in healthcare, but also out with healthcare. So when it happens, it can be big. And we also have this non-linearity of impact from a change. Again, a simple minor change, a bug in a line of code can have a very, very large effect, literally because of a minor change in a bit of code. So that's quite of note. 2 points at the end worth. Human-computer interactions. I think that there's a growing evidence base that we need to be better at that. In fact, that's taken account of in the consultation and in our sort of software roadmap that we're developing to provide guidance. We need to understand not just how the tech works, but how the tech works with the humans in the environment that they use it in, the clinicians and patients that are using it. So that's really important. And then finally, Elaine mentioned to you about post-market surveillance. Within that, everyone just uses the phrase adverse events, roughly speaking, but it's notable that post-market surveillance includes assessing for indirect harm. Indirect harm, you use information that's fairly pivotal in a patient's treatment or care, and harm occurs, then that would be classed as indirect harm. So software is very much in the space of indirect harm, but that is covered by the legislation and by what we're trying to provide guidance around. We recently released a software-specific device-specific vigilance guidance. Again, that was just published last week, again on the Software Hub page. All the references will be in this slide deck for anyone who wants it. Of course, all these things bring new risk, but they also bring unique benefits, which is why we're here. It's why so many people are using it, because there is actually fairly significant potential what can be done to help the whole collective of patients, clinicians, health services, the interaction between them. Also, lots of potential benefits there. But yeah, we have to consider all those risks that go with it. So I've covered sort of software in general, and this is a talk about artificial intelligence as a medical device, but hopefully that's positioned it as a subset within it. But how is it different? In essence, you have an input, you develop a product, that product has inputs of information, it goes into the computer, it does a thing, and then it does that to a certain level of performance or desired or declared outputs. You have those outputs, and the outputs go to the patient. How's that any different from anything else? Well, these are possibly some of the bits that are specifically notably different for artificial intelligence, and by that is that this is because you are fundamentally sort of teaching or training or running a model where you're putting in large data sets to train and create models in the first place. Even if that's a fixed model, you're still running this on large data sets. So it brings a huge challenge around the bias that can go into this, the bias of the literature, the data that's gone into it, the population you've chosen, the features of that population. Is that population the same as the population you're using it in? Does it disadvantage certain characteristics of certain groups? So bias is a real challenge. The next one is interpretability. So we have sort of explainability and transparency. They're subtly different, but two sort of different things. The way I sort of think about it, as a clinician, is the transparency element. Could I look into the software as such, and could I understand what it's doing? So when it's giving me an answer, I can understand why it gave me that answer. What were the features that mattered, that made a difference? And then the explainability. If the patient, for example, were to ask, so you're telling me the computer says I have to start this treatment or this medicine now, doctor, and why? Why is the computer saying that? If can I explain that to the patient? If I can't explain why the artificial intelligence has concluded this, then that's a problem, and it creates a real problem with trust. Another really unique feature for artificial intelligence is sort of adaptivity or changes in the program. There's a number of features such as sort of drift in the data and the data analysis that can occur, and even just updating the software, updating your data model. how do we do that? These are fairly challenging things to do. You're talking about changing live medical devices, so changing devices takes a fair amount of work, and what are the plans that we can put in place for doing that, and what risks are associated with making those changes. So these are really, they're not the only ones, but they're probably some of the biggest and most important specific issues about why artificial intelligence is sort of over and above software, and it's a bit difficult. And as Elaine mentioned earlier, you know, we're currently operating under the MDD legislation, in which at the time it was written, you know, there was no mention of artificial intelligence. So we're trying to make all this work and provide guidance along the way. Hope that helps with that. I've said it a few times, apologies folks, just to say we've got this change programme roadmap. This is on the website, and it covers a series of work packages on qualification, classification, pre-market, post-market, and cyber as well becomes important. And there's a remaining 3 which are specifically on artificial intelligence. So you'll see we've got AI rigor. That's all about the evidence, the proof that your product works, and it does work in an unbiased way, and interpretability and adaptivity. So we are already delivering sort of on this, and intend to continue delivering sort of any outputs we can as and when we can alongside legislation by way of guidance, so that we can provide as much information to sort of developers, entities, health services, patients, markets, you know, so that people can understand where we're going with this. And hopefully, so far we've actually had some pretty good positive feedback on the guidance we've put out of late. So one of those elements of guidance that we did is one of the work actions related to, I think, a good machine learning practice. So if you are in the landscape of developing artificial intelligence or machine learning programs, this is a piece of work that the MHRA did with the US FDA and Health Canada, and it produced a sort of a start point of, here are some principles to focus on if you're developing machine learning practices. Some really good ones in there. You'll see in there that, you know, the bottom, the performance of the human AI team. You have to provide users with clear and essential information. The training data sets should be different from and independent from the test sets that you used, and training and testing is different. Otherwise, you're in a way potentially marking the same homework. So this is available on the web, and is a very useful set of principles if you're setting about, you know, developing a product in this space. And then again, I've mentioned that we have produced this, what we're calling our hub page. We are trying to specifically pull, because there's so much knowledge, information, documentation in this space. We're trying for the software side of things to pull it all together into our hub page, which we launched, I think it was, yeah, there you go, April. I was going to say about 6 weeks ago. So hopefully that's useful and people can find much there, and we hope to populate that further as we go along. Elaine stole my thunder. The future consultation is a great place to go to get the results of what was concluded from that consultation. You can see the government response. You can also really interestingly see what the sort of marking from the respective respondents, be they industry or healthcare services. So that's a bit about software and AI and the specific challenges. Hopefully that's been useful. If I may, I'm just touch very briefly on a couple of other things to consider. This landscape of medicine and healthcare that we're living in is, unfortunately, becoming increasingly complicated, and that's, you know, dangerous and of concern. And it's because we're doing increasingly, you know, more advanced things, and we're improving health. But it's of note, Professor Cyril Chandler is, you know, an eminent physician who's involved in many reviews and the sort of changes to sort of smoking sort of legislation. So eminent physician, I just thought it was a useful sort of quote and worth taking note of. Something a bit more detailed than that in this complexity. On the right here, you see this is an analysis of sort of oncology treatment patients, cancer nurses, research staff from 2012 to 2015. So even in that short space of time, and that's now 8 years ago, this was in Australia, you can see the growing depth of complexity within elements of sort of complex clinical care. So, oops. We have to recognise we're working in a really complex system, particularly for AI, particularly for software. You know, you may think you change one thing over here and that will lead to a predictable outcome. Unfortunately, that's not always the case in a complex system, and it's not necessarily always the case in artificial intelligence as well. So we have to be very aware of that. And we also have to be aware that when we roll out any of these products, they go into a system that's not, it's complex, but it's not static. The system and the people around about it adapt and change as well. So it's within that environment that you really have to make sure your products are shown to work. A couple of other things, there's now some evidence. This is a paper from last month. I'll not spend too much time on it. The long and short of this one is that this was a review of machine learning devices in the States, and it's shown that there are adverse events, harm that occurs. It's often with there's a large scale problem with the data inputs to the machine learning. There's a lot of harm there, but then also use problems. There's a real challenge for a relatively small number of issues related to use problems, but actually they're more likely to be related to harm. So I just thought it was a useful paper. Again, all the references are there. I thought that'd be one worth taking note of for anyone interested. Another sort of point of consideration is the workflow automation. So if you look at this diagram here, we've got the pale blue in the middle, treatment and care delivery. That's the sort of the clinical end of healthcare, but healthcare is all of these different parts to run a healthcare system. And actually, we're sort of taking some of the most complex technology and we're deploying it in probably the most complicated part of that healthcare system, straight into clinical care. So this is a really useful paper that indicated that that's not normally what most other industries have done, is they've become increasingly digitized, or particularly using artificial intelligence. They tend to approach less complex areas to start with to learn and develop that technology. So administrative, operational, surveillance. So it just makes the case that there's lots of other advantages that can be found across the whole of the healthcare estate that could use AI, and it would all benefit the whole of the healthcare estate. But of note, we tend to have jumped in straight at the most complicated bit in healthcare, generally speaking. So that's an interesting paper. And the last thing is the evidence. So we have the intended purpose. What does your product do? But how can you prove your product does a thing? What evidence have you got for that? And the evidence question is really quite difficult, because it depends who you're asking. Are you proving it to a regulator? Are you proving it just to get an idea published, but you're not actually proving the product? Are you proving specifically that it's safe? You have to think about the whole life cycle of the product. And of course, with all new technologies, we know this, you introduce a thing and you will end up with unintended consequences, things that were not foreseen. So you have to be aware of that and capture some evidence around that. Again, humans. And getting on to the end here, we have to get to, is it economically viable? To have a valuable product, you have to do the sums on this and work out if putting all this in place, does it make sense? Is it economically viable? Is it good enough? Will people use it? So I think that evidence thing I'll sort of summarise with my own little algorithm. Not, I suppose it's somewhat artificial. These in my head are sort of three questions I ask quite a lot. Does it work? Is it safe? Is it useful? And I think anyone embarking on and involved in products should constantly reiterate those questions. Does it work? Is it safe? Is it useful? And can you prove that? And yeah, if you can do that, then you will create valuable products. So there is a lot of value can be found there, but I'm going to pause now. I'll come off screen. I believe there's a question session, and I hope that's roughly to time, folks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for a really interesting summary there. That was very clear. We have had a few questions come through in the Q&A that I will put over to both you and Elaine. But we have only got 5 minutes or so left, I think. We'll do 5 minutes of Q&A and then just wrap up the presentation. If anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to send them through to us. The whole webinar will be made available online after this session. So the first question that came in was, do Class 1 devices on the UK market by virtue of their CE mark require to apply to the UK CA mark prior to the 1st of July 2025?
I'll pick up that one from Ed. Hi Ed, nice to see you here. So CE mark devices were originally intended to be accepted onto the UK market until June 2023. That's now been extended, as you indicate, to July 2025. The extensions that we talked about really follow on from what's happening in Europe with the extension to the requirement to transition to MDR. So the only Class 1 devices that this further extension would apply to would be ones that would require the engagement of a notified body. So with the new regulation, that would be any devices that had been up-classified, that originally had been Class 1, but now have a higher classification and require a notified body to assess them, or reusable surgical instruments, which is another Class 1 function that now requires notified body. So to answer your question, for Class 1 devices that don't require any notified body engagement, they would have to be UK CA marked to the UK regulations prior to July 2025.
Okay, thank you very much, Elaine. We've got one more question in the Q&A section right now, which we can do, but if anyone has any others, please feel free to pop them in. The next question is, will there be a more streamlined way to determine if it is a medical device and what class it comes under?
So again, I can pick that up. By more streamlined, I'm not sure if you mean what's currently available or the way the new regulations are set out. There are guidance documents that are published, and currently there's a lot of guidance around the Medical Device Directive. The new guidance for the medical device regulation and for future UK regulations are very slowly coming online. So to answer your question, there will be guidelines on classification that will set out how you determine what classification your device is. And the way to determine if it's a medical device is to go to the definition, and there'll probably be a new clarified definition within the new regulations. And if you can answer yes to any of the sets of criteria that are set out in the definition, then it will be a medical device. There will also be guidelines on borderline devices, which again will come on stream as and when they're available. And there will also be the ability to go and ask for advice from MHRA if you're really not sure about borderline medical devices.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Elaine. We don't have any other questions in the Q&A right now, but as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions down the line. In the interest of time, I think we'll just carry on just now. So next slide, please. So thank you for joining today's webinar. We have recently started a webinar series here at InnoScot Health, and we've got two more coming up in the next few months. The first one is on the 21st of June 2023, and it's on protecting your intellectual property. We'll then take a break for the month of July, and previous slide, please. Then we've got one more on the 30th of August, which is the Clinical Entrepreneurs webinar. So they will all be available to register online at the address that's given there. Next slide, please. So just to sort of wrap up on some of our latest news that we've had here in InnoScot Health, we actually work with a range of partners and provide regulatory support and consultancy to them. And we're pleased to say that in April of this year, we congratulated our partner, MR Coiltech, on being awarded ISO 13485 accreditation, which is the official certification they gained after being recognised by the British Standards Institution, or BSI, for operating a compliant quality management system and meeting strict guidelines. MR Coiltech was set up in 2015 to commercialise radio frequency coil devices for a new generation of ultra-high field MRI scanners. They're a Glasgow-based company that work in the Imaging Centre for Excellence at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, where there is a CE marked 7 Tesla scanner that the company use to develop coils specially tailored towards the needs of clinicians and researchers around the world. We're very privileged to have assisted them with gaining their ISO 13485 accreditation, and we are continuing to support them in the development and commercialisation of their coils. Next slide, please. So if you have any queries, this is our website here where you can come and visit us. We have a lot of information online, but you'll also find the details of everyone who works at InnoScot Health, ways of contacting us and booking a consultation with one of our innovation team if you'd like to do that. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for attending. Here are all of our details if you wanted to contact us via email. If you have any questions after today's webinar, equally we're on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And thank you very much for attending. And thank you especially to Paul and Elaine for all of their insights and the information they've shared today.